On February 1st, 2019, I made a video called What is the Value of Bitcoin? A Thought Experiment. I'll have that video pop up for anyone who wants to check it out. And at that time, Bitcoin was trading for about $3,500. It was down from its local all-time high of $20,000. And everyone thought that Bitcoin was dead or it was over, right? And that Bitcoin was ridiculous. Today is February 1st, 2026, so 7 years later, and that video seems prescient, and Bitcoin is sitting at about $75,000 today, down from its recent local all-time high of $125,000. I don't bring this video up to prove that I was right. I bring this video up to show that the question mattered before the answer did. Today, 7 years later, I'm introducing a new experiment, and this experiment is a real-world experiment, and I've titled it, What is the Value of Belief? SPX6900, an Austrian economics experiment. And that's one of the similarities that exists between this experiment and the thought experiment I did back in 2019 is that they are both based off of subjective value theory in the Austrian economics school of thought, right? Today, SPX6900 is trading at about 30 cents, down from its recent local all-time high of $2.25. And it seemed appropriate to follow up that February 1st, 2019 video today on February 1st, 2026. And this video is not an explanation of what SPX6900 is. I have made a previous video called The Ultimate Investment Thesis for SPX6900. I'll have that video pop up. And I will also link in the description below a video made by my friend Murad Mahmudov in which he gives his investment thesis for SPX 6900. It's extremely high quality. I think it's called 100 Reasons for SPX 6900. Since February 1st of 2019, Bitcoin has kind of proven that the Austrian economics school of thought and that sound money is the correct sort of heuristic and framing for the reality of the world, and that, sort of sound money will eventually win out and beat out bad money, i.e. fiat money. And this video is not an explanation of what SPX 6900 is. It's really a call to action. If I had to boil this entire video down to one sentence, it would be this. SPX 6900 will show that subjective value theory is correct and that belief is the most important metric in all of economics. I'll be using Ludwig von Mises's Socialism, an economic and sociological analysis, to kind of guide and frame the early parts of this conversation before we jump into SPX 6900, because as I've been reading this, it's kind of helped me sort of really flesh out this thought. And so, yeah, that's where a lot of this thinking has come from. In Socialism, Mises posits that economic science originated in discussions of money price and of goods and services. Mises says that economic science started into inquiries about coinage and eventually evolved into investigations about price movements and the pricing of things. On page 111, Mises, and I quote, "Only through the rationalization inherent in economic calculation based on the use of money could the human mind come to understand and trace the laws of its action." In other words, what Mises is trying to say is that in order to try to understand economic calculation and human action, humans have essentially had to distinguish between economic behavior and non-economic behavior. But Mises says that this distinction is nonsensical, and he believes that all rational action is economic. The truth, Mises says, is that all action or all rational action is economic action. And the reason for this is because all economic activity is rational action. And this is because all rational action is, in the first place, action of the individual. Only the individual thinks and only the individual reasons, and thus only the individual acts. So let's go back to Mises' key point. All rational action is economic. There is no distinction between economic and non-economic. What some people would like to consider maybe irrational behavior, Mises believes that this behavior can be explained in other ways, right? So, for example, if someone uses their money to buy drugs and put themselves in a bad state of mind or do something that maybe is objectively harming them, like smoke cigarettes, although this may seem irrational, there's probably some underlying things, and to that individual, they believe subjectively to them that the trade-off they are making is sort of a better state, and so to themselves, they are acting rationally. So in summary, all human action is the exchange of one condition for another condition. Mises puts it this way: every man who in the course of economic action chooses between the satisfaction of two needs, only one of which can be satisfied, makes a judgment of value. So any time that I am having to choose between two conditions of life, I am imposing my subjective value onto those two conditions. For example, if I decide to go to the gym versus any other thing that I'm doing, I am subjectively valuing maybe my health or my physique or my physical appearance over some other action that I could have been taking, like maybe staying home and eating a bag of chips or reading or maybe getting some work done. Essentially, I had to choose between those two conditions, and I have made a subjective value trade. And but we live in an exchange economy, right? We live in a money-based economy, and so when you have to make a choice between two conditions of life, for example, let's say you decide to buy a home versus rent, or maybe you choose to buy a home in neighborhood A versus neighborhood B. Well, maybe the home is the exact same home, but in neighborhood B, let's say it's in a bad area, versus neighborhood A is maybe located by, let's say, parks, and maybe it's out in nature and access to maybe good food and restaurants and good education. And so there are sort of these non-economic values that are built into the price that we can't really distinguish. I think another good example is buying two different cars, right? Let's say you could choose between buying a Toyota Corolla, which is a very respectable car, gets you from A to B, functions well, works perfectly, versus buying a Porsche. Maybe the Porsche is going to be priced more, and although they are both cars, they both get you from A to B, they're sort of these intrinsic things, such as maybe beauty or honor, or with Porsche, it could be the ability to access a certain car club, or these just intangible things associated with the car, despite these goods being the exact same thing and functioning the exact same way, that Mises refers to these things as first order goods, right? And these first order goods lie outside the sphere of money calculation. And that's the reason why you often hear Austrians say things like, money is not a measure of value, right? Or money is not a yardstick of value. And the reason for this is because value is subjective, and economic money calculations cannot actually capture sort of these first order goods. So now we understand clearly that there are parts of economic activity that money exchange does not explicitly account for, and the Austrians refer to these things as first order goods. Now let's turn to meme coins. In a 2024 video by my friend Murad Mahmudov, he gave a presentation at Token 2024 in Singapore, in where he outlined a list of utilities that people get from buying meme coins. Some of the most noteworthy ones were having fun, hope provisioning, being a source of belonging, loneliness reduction, identity, being a part of cutting edge culture, experiencing teamwork. And I'm sure there are many of these utilities that we could list. And I think that in Austrian school, we can consider all of these things sort of first order goods. So now let's turn to a discussion of first order goods and sort of what is the most important and high value of first order goods. What is the first order good that drives the most value? And I will posit to you that the answer to that first order good that drives the most value creation and value accrual is faith and belief. And sort of an initial response to this inquiry of why do you think faith and belief are sort of the primary economic factor and most important economic factor of these first order goods hinges on just my understanding of sort of the history of humans and human philosophy and psychology throughout basically all civilizations, East, West, African, all civilizations. There's been sort of at the foundations questions of the reason for human existence, and there's always been sort of, I guess, a commonality of rationalizing human existence through the use of God, through the use of religion, right? And I think that what this shows to me is sort of this instinctual base level foundation of humans to sort of answer the question of existence through faith and belief of a higher power and of a God through the manifestation of religion. But I don't think we have to stop there to really answer why I believe faith and belief are the most important economic factor driving basically all of economics. And you can look at many other things, right? You could look at, for example, the existence of nation states. You could look at, for example, fiat currencies. You could look at, for example, stock markets or government bonds or Bitcoin. All of these things that are some of the sort of the biggest, the credit market, right? Some of the biggest markets in the world, a lot of them at the foundation are based on belief. And let's jump into this, right? So nation states are built off of sort of collective delusions and really arbitrary lines that we draw about and arbitrary stories that we tell each other about, sort of collective existence. I am Italian and that means X, Y, and Z, or I am Chinese and that means, A, B, and C, or I am an American and that means FGE, right? EFG. And so similarly, fiat currency is driven primarily by belief, right? In God we trust, or really in the US military we trust, or really in the US credit we trust, or maybe in the US Federal Reserve we trust. I don't care how you want to spice it up, but fiat currency is an example of a faith-based system. It goes as proof that faith and belief is the most important economic factor. The stock market is another great example, and not just the sort of indexes like the S&P 500, which are entirely based off of beliefs about, sort of the top 500 companies in the United States and packaging them into an index based off their market cap weightings, and sort of belief in the growth and faith in the growth of the top 500 American companies. But even individual equities and stocks themselves are based off a lot of faith and belief, right? If I think you've heard people talk about, sort of if you look at Tesla, for example, a lot of its value and market cap doesn't just purely come down to the sales of vehicles, right? Part of it is probably driven by faith and belief in Elon as, sort of this key figure and entrepreneur and the vision that he has built for the company. But you can also see this in things like gold, which is truly just a rock, and its value is based off of collective delusion and collective belief and stories that we have told about this rock. And Bitcoin is another sort of faith-based and belief-based asset. And this is not to say that any of these assets do not have real things backing them, right? Like fiat currencies are backed by the US military, and gold is backed by sort of the stock to flow or the scarcity of gold, the difficulty in producing gold from the earth relative to the amount of gold that already exists. Bitcoin is backed by proof of work and the miners and the electricity costs and the computation behind securing and sort of producing a new block on the Bitcoin blockchain. And the stock market is backed by contracts and, often individual companies are backed by real hard assets and cash flow, right? So although these things do have things that are backing them, right? Sort of these economic, going back to the conversation about non-economic and economic things, there are these real economic aspects of these assets, these things that we've just been talking about, but there's also a part of it that is non-economic and is really truly based off faith and belief. So now let's turn to SPX6900. And before we do that, what we need to understand is that belief as a part of economic calculation is inescapable. And it's really a question of what degree is belief explicitly or implicitly part of the asset. Are we conscious of the belief that's driving the value, or are we unconscious? And this is a great segue into what many are now calling pure belief assets, right? And this really gets back to this idea of a meme coin, because the history of meme coins stem from Doge and arguably color coins before that. But Doge was really the first one that sort of gained notoriety and drove the public consciousness of this idea of a token or a blockchain that was supposed to be a joke on the existence of Bitcoin, right? And sort of a coin whose mascot is a dog. And then came Shiba Inu, and then after that Pepe. And really what these things was they were communities, and they were driven by belief, and they were driven by sort of collective delusion, if you will. The idea of a meme was, and why they were called a meme coin, is because there was a conscious willingness, and it was explicit, that this thing is a joke, that this thing has no value, right? That this has no economic utility or has no economic value. And yet people were buying these things. And what the Austrians would say, and what I think Mises would say, is that what appears to be maybe irrational behavior, i.e. buying the thing that's going to harm you, or buying the meme coin that has no economic value, is actually economic activity, because it is rational, because it is the individual who chose to buy the meme coin, and the individual has subjectively decided that whatever it is that they are receiving from this meme coin, and that goes back to Murad's list, having fun, hope, a sense of belonging, identity, are these first order goods, are things that the person is obtaining in exchange for their money. And when we look at SPX 6900 for historical, structural, and early community reasons, SPX 6900 is the meme coin sitting at the forefront of pure belief assets, right? And a pure belief asset just plays into this idea of a meme. Essentially, it is an asset that is explicitly based off of belief. It is explicitly based off of faith. And so what I believe SPX 6900 will eventually prove is that this part of economic calculation, faith and belief, is the most important part of all of economic calculation. In that subjective value theory, which is everything is valued based off of the individual who subjectively chooses and exchanges based off of rational action, even if it may appear irrational to someone else. SPX 6900, because of the history, the lore, the fact that the dev launched and then locked the liquidity and left, and the fact that the early members of the community were very pure-hearted and were not interested in greed and chose a peaceful life over greed, but the mission of flipping the S&P 500 and flipping the stock market was so large that it sort of captured the imagination of what is possible, and sort of taking the impossible and saying we are going for that, and we are going to drive this thing that we all understand is only based off belief, and we are going to drive it to valuations equivalent to the S&P 500, which is around 69 trillion. And that will prove and will show that how valuable belief as a part of economic calculation is. And SPX 6900 is the first pure belief asset, which is why this mission and this journey that we're on, and sort of comparing the video I made in February 1st of 2019 to today, February 2026, it seems to me appropriate that this Austrian experiment shall continue, except in a new form, right? And SPX 6900 is that new form. And it really can't be emphasized enough how much the faith aspect and belief aspect drives economic behavior. And I think this is something that is not well understood by the market today. And I think that it's something that the experiment of SPX 6900 will sort of prove out. And pure belief assets as an asset class will grow, because people will come to realize and understand that belief is the most important factor in all of economic calculation. If people do not believe in it, if people do not have a collective delusion in it, and truly I implore people to look into sort of the history of SPX 6900, not just the mission, which sets this grand vision for where belief can go, but the fact that this token, which is nothing but a good based off of first order goods, but then has, of all the first order goods that there could be, right? Beauty, honor, identity, a sense of belonging, all these things that money calculations can't really account for explicitly. SPX 6900 was able to package its narrative and its story in a way where belief and faith became the first and most important first ordered good within the SPX 6900 token. And I'm very excited to be part of what I think will be an experiment for the history books, something that if SPX 6900 is able to be successful and reach the limits of what is possible, 69 trillion or bust, it will show not only governments but future generations that all value is subjective, and that when humans put their belief and faith into something, they can make an economic output real. They can meme something into reality based off of faith and belief. Stop trading and believe in something. Thank you for watching. I look forward to seeing how this aged in 7 years.